Hey, let's take a closer look at Newton's third law, the law of action-reaction. Um, this is the law that says that when one object exerts a force on a second object, the second object exerts an equal and opposite force on the first object. And this can be confusing at times. One confusing question that might come out of this is that, hey, if every force has an equal and opposite reactive force, shouldn't these forces just cancel out? And if they're canceling out, how can you have a net force that can make an object move? You got to realize that the third law really implies that forces occur in pairs. That there's a action force and then there's equal and opposite reaction force. Okay, so let's look at an example of some forces in play. We got this boy pulling on a bin of balls here, and it's pulled by a rope. Okay, and I know this is in the video. Use your imagination. He's stepping forward, and everything is moving in that direction. Okay, so let's talk about forces, and if the whole thing's in motion now, if it was at rest and it started moving, it's in motion, well then there is a net force going the direction, and forces are not canceling out. Okay, so what's going on here? What the textbook says to do is to consider a system. And you get to define the system however you like. So there's a couple ways of doing that. Let's begin by just thinking about the forces on the bin. Well, I can think of two. No, actually I can think of four. Let's think about, I was going to start with the rope tension, but let's think about the other two I just realized. Let's talk about the weight force. That might be the first one we think about. The weight. Gravity's pulling that bin down into the ground. That is the action force. The reaction force is the support force. The ground pushes back up on that bin, and so they do cancel out. That's the Newton's third law right there. Weight force has an equal and opposite reactive force, support force, and they cancel out. The bin doesn't move up or down. Well, let's see. The bin is being pulled ahead by the rope. That's one force in the horizontal direction. And friction is pulling back on the bin. And those are two forces on the bin. Okay, so if the system equals the bin only, we've identified all forces on it. Or actually, we haven't. Let's think about the third law. If we just think about forces on the bin, then sure, we've identified them all. But if we use Newton's third law and kind of break it down, just look at the horizontal directions. Let's start with the friction. The ground is pulling back on the bin. And because it's being pulled forward, it's pushing on the ground. And the ground pushes back. And that's friction. They're rubbing together. Okay, so right here, if you think about this system, just the bottom part of the bin, and I know I just kind of identified this corner, but think about the whole bottom of the bin. The bin is sliding forward, pushing against the rough concrete, and the concrete is pushing back through the force of friction. And these two forces, I shouldn't use arrows again, these two forces are equal and opposite. Okay, and if you consider the rope, well, there's a tension on the rope pulling it to the right, and that's the rope pulling to the right. And then there's equal and opposite force of the bin pulling back, kind of resisting that motion. And so that system right here, that's canceling out. Okay, so that's the third law in play. Now, how do we reconcile these two ideas of forces on the bin, the third law? It's easier, I hope, to just think about what forces are acting on the bin. What's acting on the bin? This force right here, friction, pulls back on the bin. And this force right here, the tension of the rope, is pulling forward on the bin. And then we just consider those two forces when we think about the net force on the bin. So the key word here for me is net force on the bin. That really is, so the net force is really equal to the tension going to the right minus friction pulling it to the left. And these two forces are not equal. The tension force is greater than the friction force, and so the bin, moves forward to the right. Let's think of a different system. Let's think about the boy. Forces on the boy. Well, let's see. He is moving forward, so he's pushing off of here, moving forward. So just say walking force, if you will. And what's pulling back on him is the tension. The rope and the bin, the rope connected to the bin, is pulling back on him, keeping him from moving forward quickly. And if you consider a different system, just his hand, okay, just think about the tension pulling back on his hand by the rope. His hand and arm is pulling forward. And that system, just where the rope meets his hand, there's a force he's exerting pulling to the right, and the rope's resisting that force, creating tension to the left. And those forces are equal and opposite. On the ground, well, that's kind of interesting. The ground is actually what's pushing him forward. That's a reactive force to him pushing backwards on the ground. So this is Newton's third law right here at the point of contact of his feet hitting the ground. Yeah, that sounds kind of weird, I know. The ground pushing on the bottom of the foot. It might be helpful to contrast this with walking on ice with, I don't know, very slippery shoes or some ice skates, and let the ice skate slide without friction. If you shove your foot backwards, your foot will just keep going backwards and you won't move forward on ice. That's because the blade won't be catching the ice. There won't be any friction, and you simply just shove your foot backwards and you don't go anywhere. Now you need a reactive force, the ground or the ice catching the blade and pushing back, resisting that motion of the blade against the ice, and that resistance is what's going to propel you forward. If we put the whole thing together, well, then we got the walking forward minus the friction, and that's defining the whole system as the boy and the bin of balls all together. And we're going to neglect all those other low forces, right? So the net on the system kind of reduces, it simplifies. So how much is the boy pulling back, or trying to walk forward, versus the cart sliding backwards? Sliding, I shouldn't use that word. It's being dragged backwards by friction. I hope that's helpful. Let's kind of test that idea and see if it is. So I have an older car. It's a stick shift manual transmission, and if the alternator or the battery goes bad, I can't start the car with the key. And what you can do is you can put it in neutral and have someone else push on the car, and when the car's in motion, you pop the clutch and you put it in gear quickly by popping the clutch, and the motion of the car will turn the engine, and you turn the engine while that's starting the car. So on a cold, wet day, it'd be nice to stay inside, not be outside in the elements. So why can't you move a car by pushing from the inside? So this guy's like pushing on the steering wheel, trying to make it go. That's silly, I know. But why doesn't that work? He's inside the car, sitting on a seat, pushing on the steering wheel. So let's think about all the forces on the car. Okay, well, right here, he's pushing on the steering wheel, trying to push it forward. The other force on the car is his butt and back is pushing back against the seat here. And that's because as he pushes on the steering wheel, he shoves forward, trying to move the car forward, but the steering wheel shoves him backwards, right? It resists his motion, pushes him backward, and that pushes him into the seat. And it turns out that this force, equal and opposite to the pushing force, well, that's the same as this force against the seat. So you can't shove the car forward based on Newton's third law. As you push forward, that's the action force. There's an equal and opposite reaction force right back on the car in the opposite direction. And they truly do cancel out. No, the only way to get the car moving is get out of the car. So separate yourself from the system. Here's the system, now the car. And there's an external force, this poor guy who's shoving on it, shoving on the car forward. And we got the friction. We got some friction from the wheels moving backwards, but really you got the inertia of the car pushing back, just resisting the force. All right, I hope that's helpful.